So we're moving into Chapter 10, Competitive Forces. Now this area of the course is important because, as we know, all businesses need to have a feel for competition, the forces that exist in their market or indeed their industry. These forces will impact upon their success month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. First area of force we'll see is just really a fix on Porter's five forces model. Now, we know that Porter is important within the SBL syllabus, and if any model is at the top, then it's this, Porter's five forces. These forces are, in one sense, the sort of essence of the industry or market. Before we go into the model here, let's just define exactly what we mean by competition and indeed competitors, and indeed how this ties into Porter's thesis on the five forces. So when we think about competition, what do we mean? Well, really the idea of any sort of activity within the industry that affects the level of margin earned. So if we think about it, if we have a fiercely competitive environment, a fiercely competitive industry, then clearly the level of margin earned will be lower. In one sense, what Porter does within this thesis on the five forces is really say, if we have a particular industry or indeed a market where the range of forces is very, very strong, in effect, the competition level is very, very high, then this probably makes that market or that industry less attractive and indeed less profitable, i.e. the margins will be lower. So if we take a look at the model itself and indeed the various elements of it and really the areas that strengthen the forces or weaken the forces, what we'll see in effect, if we focus right on the middle, is that in the middle we have this area of rivalry, or if you will, competitive rivalry. And then on the outside we have the four other forces. So in essence, really, the most important force, and indeed the force that drives margins or drives attractiveness or drives profitability, is this one, is rivalry. And all the other four are sort of secondary in one sense. So if we go from bargaining power of buyers first, and we go around the model, what do we mean first and foremost by buyers? Well, we're talking about consumers. We're talking about customers. So, for example, in the cell phone industry, you and I are buyers. And indeed, when we talk about bargaining power of buyers, broadly speaking, we're talking about the degree to which a buyer, let's say me or you, can influence a telecoms firm, can influence perhaps a price, or can influence the deal. So in essence, when we say bargaining power of buyers, we're talking about the strength or the power of buyers, the degree to which they can place some sort of pressure or some sort of influence on the company itself. Now, when we think about what factors impact upon that particular strength of force, there are a variety. And indeed note that with an SBL exam type question, what the examiner will be doing is perhaps looking to see if you can pick up these various elements from the scenario. So we'll deal with some but not all. So when we think of this bargaining power of buyers, first things first, the concentration of buyers. In other words, if there are fewer buyers in this industry or market, it's highly likely that they're going to be more powerful. With the example that I gave you in terms of the cell phone industry, obviously there are millions and millions of buyers in the market. So for any cell phone company, perhaps to lose you, or perhaps to listen to your concerns about price or indeed the cost of the phone, that's probably quite unlikely. Because at the end of the day, there are millions and millions of other buyers. So your power to influence a cell phone company is very, very low or very, very weak. Other areas that are sort of relevant here, let's pick out low switching costs. What do we mean by switching costs? We're talking about really the idea that there is a cost associated from, let's say, switching from one cell phone company to another. And broadly speaking, although it will vary from situation to situation, broadly speaking, there is a fairly low switching cost for an individual to change cell phone suppliers. So in essence, in one sense, you would suggest that really, the power is quite high in that respect. In other words, it's quite easy for a cell phone user to switch from one company to the other. But certainly in relation to the example I've just given, i.e. cell phones, really, yes, that's one area that sort of supports the power of buyers, but there are too many others in that scenario that sort of undermine it. Outside of that, when we think about things like the cost of the purchase, in other words, the degree to which this purchase is a high proportion or a high element of total overall cost, that's certainly relevant too. So in essence, in relation to the bargaining power of buyers, really what we're saying is, what are the factors that sort of either strengthen that force or weaken it? And obviously in SBL type scenarios, it's going to vary from question to question. In essence, let's remember with each of the 5 forces, and particularly the ones on the outside, we're really looking to assess as to whether or not the force is high strength, medium, or low strength. Let's take a look at bargaining power of suppliers now. Now again, what do we mean by this? We're talking about any suppliers. So for example, if we have a company manufacturing widgets, whatever they are, we're talking about really the source of inputs into the manufacture of that widget. Now again, first things first, when we think about suppliers to, let's say, the manufacturer of widgets, if there are very, very few suppliers, so for example, if a part, if a component, if a raw material is quite difficult to obtain, and indeed there are only a few suppliers for that particular part or component, then certainly the power will be going up, because the firm or indeed the entity may find it difficult to source that component or part elsewhere. So if there are a low number of suppliers, a little bit like buyers, if there are a low number of buyers, as we said, the power goes up. It's the same with suppliers. Outside of that, when we think about substitutes, really what we're talking about there is really a particular sort of product or indeed service that satisfies the same needs, but that is manufactured or delivered in a different way. So in one sense, what we're saying there, if there are very, very few substitutes in this sense, then obviously the power is going to go up. Outside of that, same thing here we saw for buyers, switching costs are high. In other words, the bargaining power of suppliers is higher where an entity is going to incur high costs to switch to another supplier. Perhaps in the form of a contract, perhaps in the form of they need to go abroad, etc., etc., etc. Outside of that, let's take a look at differentiation here. When we say the product, the supplier's product is differentiated, what we're talking about is that the supplier has a product that has some unique characteristics. In other words, it's very, very difficult to obtain this quality, this type of product, or this particular supplier's product has a number of features that other suppliers' products do not have, and we need that particular element, that particular component, that particular part. So in essence, what we're saying here is that the power of this particular supplier goes up when the supplier is producing a product that we need, that is very, very different and indeed unique in some respect to other suppliers' products. So that deals with the left-hand side, the buyers, and indeed the right-hand side, the suppliers. And you'll note that there's certainly a parallel, a crossover between the two. Let's take a look at barriers to entry now, okay? Now, what we mean here, remember, we're talking about competition. We're talking about a given industry or market. And what Porter says under the banner of barriers to entry is that there may be a number of elements sort of in play in that industry, in that market, that really discourage firms from entering it, or maybe encourage firms to get out of it. What do we mean by economies of scale? Well, it may well be that there are large players in the industry that are producing massive volumes. And in effect, what they're doing is that they're spreading their fixed costs over their production and or their sales. In other words, they have economies of scale. Because they're so large, their cost base, in effect, per unit is much, much lower. Now, in essence, to compete with companies like that, or to enter the market and compete, it's difficult because they already have these massive, well-established economies of scale. And indeed, they may well have other cost advantages. Another obvious barrier to entry is capital requirements. Let's say that you're looking to enter a market, and indeed that particular market requires a massive investment of cash. That may be difficult to come by. That's what we mean by capital. Do you have enough funding to be able to enter this market? And note, in effect, what we're saying is that if these barriers to entry are very, very high, then in effect, this force is very, very strong. This makes the industry, or indeed the market, less attractive. So in other words, high barriers to entry makes the industry an industry, or the market a market. Well, you'll be thinking, well, this is a tough market to enter into. Let's take one other here. What about reactions of existing firms? In other words, what we're saying is, let's just say that you're considering entering a particular market or industry. If players who exist in the market already will react in some way quite aggressively, for example, in relation to, let's say, prices or price wars, etc., that's not going to be good news. That's going to be difficult. You may think that they may not do anything, but as soon as you enter, or 2 to 3 months after, a price war starts. That's not good for business. That makes this industry or market potentially risky to enter, unattractive, and possibly a market with maybe low margins, low profitability in due course. So in essence, note that in relation to barriers to entry, really what we're talking about is, things that make it difficult, things that make it tricky for entities to newly enter a market. Okay? Now, a couple of other points. In terms of our overall fix so far, really what we're saying, remember, is that in the application of Porter's 5 forces, we're trying to assess what Porter suggests are the key or main forces that make an industry attractive or unattractive, or profitable or non-profitable. So let's take a look at the fourth and indeed last force before we look right smack bang in the middle at rivalry again. The threat of new substitutes. Now, let's be clear here, and it's an area that students tend to fall down on. A substitute. What is it? First things first, a substitute is not a competitor's product. It's not a direct substitute, as it were, in the normal sense of the word, for your product. A substitute, as I said earlier on, is really a product that satisfies the same need, but it is manufactured or delivered in a different way. One more time. It satisfies the same need, but it's manufactured or delivered in a different way. So maybe a typical example would be something like Coke or Coca-Cola and water. What's the need? Thirst. Are they, direct competitors? I don't think so. But are they substitute products? You could substitute one for the other. Yes, you could. Why? Because certainly they satisfy the need for thirst, but they're manufactured and delivered in a completely different way. So be careful on this area. I've seen students get confused here and say, well, it's basically the same as a competitor product. No, Coca-Cola and Pepsi are competitor products, but they're not substitutes as such. We're talking about a product that really is based on a need, okay? Now, in terms of the questions here, when we think about the threat of new substitutes, so we're talking really about anything, any other product that satisfies the same need. You might even include, for example, cell phones versus landlines. So here, second bullet point down, to what extent is there a danger? Well, are there a lot of substitute products? Because if there are, we have a concern. Obviously, we also have a concern if there are many, many competitor products. But substitutes, remember, is different. So, are there many, many other substitute products? Could consumers, customers, could they simply replace our product in some way quite easily? If they can, then this threat is high. We're concerned that makes this market or industry less attractive, less profitable. Outside of that, maybe, okay, there are substitute products, but, can we do something about it? Can we minimize this threat? Could we maybe differentiate our product more, or indeed do something about our costs or lower our prices? Outside of that, bottom line is this. We've been through the four main forces here, and we've considered areas that drive the power up or possibly drive the power down. Now, when we take a look at the middle, remember, as we said, in relation to rivalry, really, what we're talking about is, a variety of different things, number, strength, differentiation, etc., etc., etc. So, in essence, this factor, this force in the middle, which in one sense is probably the most important one, indeed driven on by each of the other four. Where they're a similar size, where these rivals are a similar size, then certainly that makes things much, much worse, because they may well have similar strategies, similar approaches, etc. Outside of that, imagine a market where, let's say, there are a number of rivals, and indeed they are a similar size, and it is broadly profitable. If there's slow growth in the market, that makes things more difficult because people are fighting for inches. Outside of that, think about things like differentiation. If it's very, very difficult for firms to differentiate the product because of its nature or type, that makes rivalry even more pronounced. Last one here, a little bit unusual. We're thinking about a particular industry. Well, let's say it's extremely difficult to exit. For example, let's say clothing stores, retail high streets where you're tied into leases over 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It may well be that you're a bit stuck. It's difficult or indeed expensive to exit that market. That makes things much more competitive on the high street. So in essence, in relation to Porter's five forces, I've said several things. The first thing is this is a very, very important model. And indeed, within the SBL exam, note that the examiner very, very rarely sort of highlights the use or requires the use of a particular model. What he tends to say are things like use a suitable model. And where he does, and where the scenario or the requirement is in the area of assessment of an industry or assessment of a market, more often than not, Porter's five forces is one of our go-to models, along with, say, Pestel or possibly Porter's Diamond. But Porter's five forces is certainly up there with many, many other models in terms of highly examinable. So have a fix on it, have a fix on each of the 5 forces, particularly the 4 on the outside, and be prepared to look at scenarios and maybe pick up little hints here and there of areas that are either driving the power of the force up or driving it down. Okay? I hope that makes sense. Let's move on to our next area here. Now, this is really a sort of some add-on information over and above what I've just said. So we're talking about really additional key points that may well be useful in the exam in terms of the use of this model and indeed picking up information from the scenario. So in terms of the new entrants, we basically said, okay, we're talking about barriers. We're talking about high barriers to entry. Now note, if we have extensive and indeed high barriers to entry, then obviously that makes entering the market much less likely. You know, the higher the barriers, the lower the threat of new entrants. Now, when we think about these threats, really there's 3 main things for me that we should consider. Bear with me. The first things first. Now, new entrants, if they enter, will bring new capacity. Okay? In other words, they may bring new skills, new ideas, new marketing techniques, etc. So in terms of this threat, this is an area that could affect pricing in some way. In other words, either the new entrant's pricing or indeed your pricing. Second key threat is obviously market share. You know, if we have an entity that is disregarding barriers and decides to enter, they're looking to snap up market share as quickly as possible. They want to achieve critical mass as quickly as possible and indeed exploit any economies of scale. That is an important threat. Third key area, and indeed third key threat in one sense, is highly likely that if we have new entrants to the market, that all players in the market, all existing players, and indeed possibly the new one also, will face increased costs. Because invariably, where you have a new player entering the market, you're going to have reaction on the players that are in that market. That may be reaction in a number of different ways. You know, they may want to erect more barriers and maintain barriers. They may want to deter any other new entrants in the near future. So the bottom line is this, is highly likely that new entrants to the market are going to create increased costs in some way, shape or form for all players in the market. Let's look at substitutes. Remember what we said. We said substitutes, not competitors' products. They satisfy the same need, Coke and water, but manufactured and delivered in a different way. So what sort of defenses could we use? Well, perhaps produce and control them. In other words, if we know that there are significant substitutes, why don't we acquire them? Why don't we acquire several and indeed control these substitutes? If we're worried about them, it's best to own them. And indeed, similarly, or buy them. Outside of that, this was touched on up top in the actual model. You know, what if we differentiate our product? Okay, there is a substitute, but if our product has features unique to it, it may well be that buyers are sort of more interested in sticking with us and less interested in that substitute. Let's get the consumers or the customers thinking that, well, there's really no real substitute for what you have. Your product's unique, it's got great features, etc. There's no substitute for it. Next area for us is in relation to buyer. Now remember, these 5 points are really sort of add-ons to what we said above. So again, you know, what we said above in relation to buyers is really, you know, the number is important, the degree to which they can influence us is important, etc. So, you know, when we think about, you know, large entities. Let's say we have buyers and they're very, very large and there's a few of them, as we said up top. That creates a problem. That makes them much more powerful. Think about a supermarket, for example, that buys fruit and vegetables, or let's say a supermarket chain in the UK, maybe Tesco's, Sainsbury's, etc. They have massive clout. They have massive buying power in relation to the suppliers of fruit and vegetables. Outside of that, this one here we dealt with above in terms of the proportion of total buyers' costs. In terms of undifferentiated, and when we think about goods and services that are fairly standard or undifferentiated, that makes it more and more problematic, I guess, for the supplier. Because if the particular product that the buyer is looking for can be bought from many alternative suppliers, then certainly that power goes up, and indeed the power of the supplier goes down. Remember also we touched on switching costs, and this goes both for buyers, which we're talking about now, but also suppliers. If it's very easy for buyers to switch, for example, let's say that your relationship with your cell phone provider, you have a pay-as-you-go phone, very, very easy today to switch to another supplier, for sure. Okay? Next key point for us is in relation to buyers. And again, as we said up top, there's a sort of a parallel between power of buyers and indeed power of suppliers. For example, think about number. If the numbers are very, very low, i.e. very few buyers or very few suppliers, then obviously that power goes up. Okay? As we said here, few suppliers makes these suppliers much more powerful. Again, as we said, that we talked about the substitutes. And then in terms of the customer here, this is an interesting one. Remember, we're talking about suppliers. We're talking about a company supplying another company with a component or a part, etc. Now, if the supplier perceives the customer to be quite small or unimportant, then really the power of the suppliers goes up. So in one sense, if we reverse the scenario on cell phone companies and you, then certainly I would suggest to you that cell phone companies don't particularly see you, or indeed me, as particularly important because we're small, we've got no clout. So in one sense, these cell phone companies can price as they want. They can sort of do what they want because individual customers, because there are so many, are not overly important, too small. Last point here is in relation to the sort of importance of the product, in terms of the overall total cost of the overall package. That certainly is a factor, and we mentioned that up top as well. Okay. Last one is rivalry. Remember, within the model, this is right in the middle. So sort of influenced by each of the other four factors. I always like to deal with rivalry last in one sense. Now, again, a couple of points we made that are up top that are relevant. If we have, equally balanced firms, and what we mean by that is broadly speaking in terms of size, that certainly makes that rivalry much, much more worse. And indeed, we mentioned about the idea of growth as well. Okay, just one here, just touch on brand loyalty. When we think about brand loyalty, then certainly in terms of a particular industry where there isn't really a particularly high level of brand loyalty, let's say, for example, again using the mobile phone market, there would certainly be a high brand loyalty, I would suggest, in relation to cell phones, because some individuals will only buy an iPhone and they won't touch other phones. So in that sense, it would be the reverse. Okay, but really what we're talking about here is rivalry being most powerful where there is little brand loyalty. In other words, people will jump ship without question, without hesitation. And that obviously links into differentiation, the idea that products aren't really different from one to the other. So, it's a market where people will jump ship. It's a market where, competitors and players in the market know that people aren't loyal because the products are very, very similar, and they'll fight to the death, tooth and nail, to get your business. Okay, so this is the area of Porter's 5 forces. Let's move on now to a broader area, if you will, that isn't so much model-based, customers and indeed markets. So let's talk about some very, very broad issues here. Typical markets. I mean, there are a number. I guess the one that most of us would be most familiar with is the idea of consumer markets. So you and I, our choice perhaps of supermarkets, our choice of telephones, our choice of holidays, etc., etc. Moving from that, obviously, we have industrial markets and indeed government markets, government supplied goods, etc., reseller, and indeed markets abroad or indeed export markets. So in terms of really, excuse me, in terms of customer, when we think of sort of what customers want, we think of areas such as the main consumer goods. In other words, the goods that we buy on a regular basis, perhaps in a supermarket, perhaps on the high street elsewhere. Generally speaking, when we buy those goods, when individuals buy those goods, there's no further processing required. We can simply go to an entity, go to a shop, buy it, and then we're gone. What sort of things are we talking about? Well, we're talking about things that are used by individuals. Toothpaste as a simple example. What about the flip side of that, industrial goods? Now, generally speaking, industrial goods are used to do something else. They're used to make something else. So a simple example perhaps is going to be something like raw materials. I could have chosen perhaps equipment in some way. Okay? So in this section here, we're simply saying that there are different types of customer and indeed different types of market. So, why does that matter? Why does that matter to us? Well, because I think that when we think about market segmentation, this particular chapter is all about competition and indeed segmenting the market and understanding different segments or parts in the market is quite important if you're trying to understand competition. So what exactly do we mean by segmentation? Well, in terms of segmentation, as you probably guessed, we're talking about really a sort of a division of the market, a breaking up of the market into sort of parts, if you will. Because if we can break a market up into parts or into, I guess, homogeneous groups of potential customers, then in one sense, it may well be that those customers can be treated similarly because they operate similarly. They think in a similar way. So segmentation is really all about, well, in a given market, there are bound to be different types of customers. And if we can understand how that market breaks down into parts, maybe we can target each type in a different way for marketing purposes. So in terms of a segment, we're talking about each of these parts where perhaps individual customers have similar needs and they may think in a different way to other customers in other parts of the market. Okay? So there's the definition for us. Now, why is that important? Well, when we think about different parts of different markets, if we can break them down into different areas, as mentioned up top, we may be able to get access to them more easily. Now, when we think about access, what type of segment bases are there? Geographic is a pretty simple one. We have a particular country, we have a market split up into north, south, east, west, just simply different areas in terms of geography. Perhaps we might think about lifestyle. Perhaps we might think about like couples versus married couples. We might think of teenagers versus sort of older individuals, or perhaps even purchasing characteristics, how people buy, when they buy, is it seasonal? Do they generally tend to buy in person? Do they buy online, etc.? Demographics is also important. When we think of demographics, obviously we're talking about things like economic group, perhaps middle class versus lower class or lower income. We're talking about things like life cycle. Perhaps we have a new family with young children or babies, or perhaps we have a retired couple. So each of these areas in terms of basis is different and indeed important to us. Because, as I mentioned up top, understanding segmentation and understanding segments gives us a better need for the psychology, the buying power, the characteristics of different parts of this market. That means that we can get access to them easier. Okay? So, moving on from there, when we think about consumers, I guess the flip side, as we said up top, is industrial. Now, industrial works in a very, very similar way as you see here, perhaps on the basis of geography, perhaps on the basis of types of product manufactured, or indeed, the purchasing characteristics, or maybe even just the size and type of the company. So in terms of segmentation basis, there's a little bit of a parallel. Let's try and just sort of be familiar with the various ways that we can do it. We don't need to rote learn every possible base in terms of consumer versus industrial. Let's think about things like geographic, demographic, purchasing characteristics, lifestyle, etc. We don't need to know everything. Now, in terms of segmentation criteria, what I mean by that is that, when we look at segments of a different market, we can break a market down into segments, but we need to be careful here. The availability or indeed measurability of information is quite important, as is sort of accessibility to a segment. When we think about, let's say, a given market, let's say we're using a segmentation base for consumers in terms of geography. Yeah. And when we think about this area of accessibility, yes, we've broken down the market. We can see that there are a multitude of segments, let's say north, south, east, west. But in terms of distribution to, let's say, one or two of those segments, it's extremely difficult. Therefore, it's not viable to pursue that particular segment. So when we talk about criteria, it's all well and good breaking down a market, but we need to be able to, for example, have access to it. We also need to be able to avail of information in relation to that particular segment. In addition to that, obviously, if we see different parts or different segments of a given market, the size of that segment is quite important. If we only have a small number of consumers in this particular segment, then it may not be worth pursuing accessing that segment. Final point here is about stability. In other words, we may well see several parts or several segments to a given market, but if, let's say, the buying behavior is a little bit volatile, maybe not a little bit, maybe a lot, then is it worth trying to pursue or access that segment? If the buyers are a little bit unpredictable, then that's a problem for us. That makes that segment less attractive. Broadly speaking, what this area of the mind map says is we need to be able to access information about this segment. It needs to be accessible. We need to be able to get at it. It needs to be big enough, and indeed, the consumers within this segment, they need to be fairly stable. If we can't predict what they're going to do next month, next quarter, next year, that's an issue. That makes the segment less attractive. Now, let's just say that we have found our segment. It could be geographic, perhaps it's lifestyle, perhaps it's purchasing characteristics. Then really, we need to target particular segments. Now, when we're targeting these segments or targeting markets, what sort of areas should we consider? Well, several. The needs of the customers. Remember that marketing is broadly about understanding customer needs and indeed satisfying customer needs. If our product or our service doesn't do that, then individual consumers are not going to buy from us. Now, outside of that, in terms of segments, well, we're very, very interested in the competitive forces. Remember, we said up top in relation to Porter's 5 forces that competition in a particular industry market is, and knowing about it is crucial. If the forces are really, really strong, if there has been serious rivalry in recent years in relation to this segment, then this makes it less attractive. Given that, strategies. So, for example, we're looking at a particular market, we've broken it down into lifestyle or purchasing characteristics, and we see that rival strategies include serious and heavy-duty price wars. That makes that particular part of that particular market, that segment, unattractive. Getting into a segment that has historically involved a number of heavy-duty price wars between rival firms is not something that we should really, really target to do. Okay? Now, in terms of marketing, quite a few points here. This isn't every possible approach to marketing. We know with the sort of advent of the internet, social media, etc., that marketing has changed in so many different ways over the course, in particular, of the last 20 years. So these are just a couple of options. First things first, mass marketing. So we were talking about not so much segmentation or targeting a particular segment. We're talking about mass marketing to the entire market with a single product, no segmentation at all. There's the market, it's the whole of the UK or the whole of Italy, the whole of Germany. Let's just market entirely to everybody. It might well be perhaps in relation to consumer goods such as food, etc. A mass marketing approach is better, possibly on TV, etc. Next area for us is sort of differentiated, segmented market. So we're talking here about the idea of several versions of the product in one particular segment. Last point here is in relation to concentrated marketing. So perhaps in terms of a luxury car, maybe a Ferrari, we're talking about an optimal product in a single market. So note that they were just 3 broad approaches to marketing. There are many, many other approaches to marketing outside of that. Let's take a look at the value chain now. So what we've done so far is really focus on an external tool, i.e. Porter's 5 forces, and indeed the area of competition and indeed markets, and really targeting, segmenting. Now what we're going to do is really look at something that's more internal. The idea that, if we can analyze ourselves internally, we can be more efficient. Or indeed, possibly, if we could analyze using Porter's value chain a competitor, then maybe we'll pick up some hints and tips in relation to why this particular competitor is successful and maybe copy them as best practice. So in terms of the definition here, really we're talking about a model that sort of enables or facilitates a sort of categorization of an organization's processes into groups, based on how these processes create value. Let me put that in a different way. What this model really does is says that, a business is really a series of processes or a series of activities. So if we categorize them, if we break down the business into the various parts that Porter suggests, then we can really observe, value-adding and indeed non-value-adding activities. Let's look at the model in a little bit more detail and explain further. So what we see here is, broadly speaking, a two-part model. You'll see support activities on the top, 4 of them. And then outside of that, you'll see primary activities on the bottom. So really what Porter is suggesting is that, again, most businesses, and do remember that this particular model from, I believe, 1980 was really geared towards manufacturing businesses, but, professional bodies such as the ACCA and indeed SEMA will wheel it out in questions across the board, not just for services and not just for manufacturing, for products, all types. So in essence, we're sort of generalizing, but we're saying many, many businesses will be able to pigeonhole all of their processes or all of their activities into these 9 areas, with really the primary activities being the most important. This is really what the firm does, and these are really secondary or support. So why is the model set up in such a way with this sort of arrow heading to the right? Well, really what we're saying there is that with a given business, all of these activities are supposed to be driving margin. They're supposed to be driving profitability. Remember, in terms of the definition up top, we said that, all activities within a business, wherever they are pigeonholed, either within the 4 support or indeed the 5 primary, should be adding value, should be creating value. And really what Porter says is that where a business or a user of this model breaks down a firm into processes or activities, they should be looking to confirm that all of the activities under each of the 4 support banners or indeed the 5 primary headings should be adding value. And if an activity is seen not to be adding value or creating value, then really it should be eliminated. Everything under this banner of the 9 main areas should be pushing towards the margin. So in essence, I guess, Porter's value chain is about efficiency and indeed driving margins. It's about the user saying, okay, we need to make sure that all the activities of our business add value, they create value. And if they don't, then let's get rid of them. Now, in terms of the key components here, these are fairly straightforward. Let's deal with support first. Now, in terms of procurement processes or indeed procurement activities, we're talking about the buying function. We're really talking about any activity that involves buying, whether or not that's buying items linked to cost of sales, whether or not that's buying buildings, equipment, cars, etc. We're talking about the buying function in the broad sense of the word. Outside of that, technology development. We're talking about anything to do with technology, not just from an admin perspective, but also from a practical, indeed, business perspective. Excuse me. It may well be that we're a heavy IT user, and indeed technology impacts upon every single part of our business. In terms of human resource management, again, sort of does what it says in the tin. We're talking about sourcing, finding, selecting, and indeed maintaining, augmenting, appraising staff, people, everyone from the ground up, and any activity associated with that. Excuse me. In terms of infrastructure, we're talking about everything that really supports the business. That might be accounting, legal, cleaning, catering, etc., etc., etc. So again, in terms of these support activities, we're talking about anything in this area that is a process, that is an activity. And if we would use this model, let's list those processes and activities down under these banners. In terms of the primary activities, remember, as I said, these are the important areas. What Porter says is a business at its core is about some form of inbound logistics. If you imagine, let's just say that a particular business manufactures widgets. So really, those component parts, those elements, those raw materials will be incoming. So there will be processes around the receipt or reception of those component element parts, etc., etc. In terms of the operations, well, I guess here we're talking about maybe working on those component parts, elements, etc., to sort of turn them into our product. This is where we do our operations. What are the processes associated with that? Once we have the product ready, though, well, we need to get these widgets out to consumers, maybe to retailers, maybe abroad, maybe we're going to export, etc. So outbound logistics is about getting those widgets out the door. How do we do that? How do we distribute? Is it in trucks? Do we take them by hand? Are they sent by train, by plane, etc., etc.? So any process or activity involved in getting that widget or widgets out the door. Here we're talking about sales and marketing. And again, this does what it says in the tin. How do we sell? Where do we sell? In what way? How regularly? Is it online, television? Is it by flyers, etc., etc.? In terms of service, again, does what it says in the tin. We're really talking about customer service in every sense of the word, including, for example, let's say that some widgets are returned from time to time. How do we deal with that? What is our return service? And then outside of that, broadly speaking, how do we organize customer service? Do we have a telephone unit? Is it in the UK? Is it in Spain? Is it in America? How do they operate? So in essence, I know that I've gone through this reasonably quickly. What I'm trying to say or get across to you is that, PVC or Porter's Value Chain is a great internal tool. It allows the user to really analyze a business's activities and processes, to maybe streamline them, to make them more efficient, because the bottom line is we want to increase margin. We want to be more efficient in this competitive marketplace. Okay, let's move on now to one of the key words, or really favorite words of many, many examiners, competitive advantage. What do we mean by that? Well, when we think about competitive advantage, the simple way to think about advantage is to think about edge or competitive edge. The idea that some businesses have an edge for some reason or other over other businesses. Now, to use a more sort of highbrow definition, we're talking about here about SBUs or business units sort of creating value for users that is greater than the cost of supplying them and superior to that of rival SBUs. That's a little bit of a mouthful. When we talk about a strategic business user, we're really talking about, broadly speaking, a business or maybe part of a business. And all that this definition simply says is, I want to create value for my customers, i.e. users. And I can create that value, excuse me, in a way that the cost of creating that value is obviously less than what I'm going to get for that value. So the consumer is going to pay me a fair amount for that value over and above what it's cost me. And indeed, that process or the idea of creating that sort of excess over and above the costs is superior to that of rival SBUs or perhaps rival competitors. Okay? So that is competitive advantage. Remember, simple definition, edge. Now, in terms of a strategic business unit, you could see it as a competitor, the competition, or you might see it as a sort of a part of an organization. But the bottom line is this: we're talking about some form of profit-making element of a business, of a firm, or indeed we're just simply talking about a competitor in a given marketplace for goods or indeed services. Let's move on from there. to value networks, or indeed the value network concept. Okay, now this is quite important, and indeed it links into what we've said up top about the value chain. So when we looked at the diagram for the value chain, what we saw was primary versus secondary activities. But do remember that those 9 areas with the 4 up top, and indeed the 5 primary down the bottom, that's basically the firm, isn't it? What Porter is saying is that's a business. That's how you break a business down. Now, if we take that one step further, what we're saying here in terms of the value network concept is really the idea that if we have a firm's value chain here, certainly a firm doesn't exist in isolation. A firm is surrounded by other firms. So, for example, a firm will have supplier value chains, other businesses perhaps that are involved in supplying inbound logistics. Outside of that, on the other side of the fence, there will be firms that are on the distributor side, and perhaps the distributor value chain is linked into the customer's value chain. Outside of that, we know, because we're talking about competition here, that there will be many, many, many rival value chains. So going back to the start, when we talk about the value network or the value network concept, certainly we're talking about inter-organizational links and indeed relationships that are needed to create a product or service, and indeed to deliver that product or services to the end consumer. So in essence and in summary, firms don't exist in isolation. There are hundreds of thousands and millions of value chains in this area of the value network. Okay? Let's move on to this next area in terms of their role. What is the role of these value networks? In other words, why are they important? Well, the first thing is that if you recognize or accept that a business exists and is indeed surrounded by many, many, many value chains, let's think about cost and price structures. Because we need to know, for example, what rival value chains are doing. How do they cost? How do they price? We also need to consider, as we said up top, if we just take a quick look at the diagram, we need to consider how suppliers are costing. And indeed, are there other suppliers that perhaps are more competitive for us? Second area, profit pools. When we look at the diagram just at the top of the page, are there areas of this particular value network that are much, much more profitable than other areas? Are we in the wrong place? Or is an acquisition perhaps a good idea, perhaps of a supplier of ours? You can see here there's reference to make or buy. At the moment, broadly speaking, we do much of our production ourselves, but is there an option for us perhaps to outsource some element of our production, or perhaps more of our distribution? Outside of that, when we think about the value network, maybe there's an option for us to partner perhaps with a distributor or perhaps with another supplier, possibly with a rival. So these are the areas when you look at this big, as it were, value network that we should be thinking about. Okay? Next area for us is, sorry, bear with me one second. The next area for us is the sort of the influence in one way. Given the areas up top, things like costs and prices and possibly partnerships and, where the profit is, etc. In terms of how value networks influence firms, then certainly, there will be the possibility of a certain amount of cooperation or indeed collaboration. At the end of the day, businesses exist with common goals. They may well rely on each other. They may well need to rely on each other more. Outside of that, certainly some element of cooperation or indeed collaboration will foster innovation. This will help the development and indeed the quality of the end product. So in essence, what we're saying in this part of the mind map is, these value networks aren't just about separate firms competing against each other. They are about other areas as well, and indeed driving up the sort of quality of the industry and indeed improving the product for the end consumer. Next area for us is integration, and this is linked to, I guess, the area that I've just mentioned in several ways. So first things first, what do we mean by integration? Well, we talked up top about the idea of a particular firm maybe looking at the value network that exists in, and maybe thinking about, relationships, thinking about the possibility of acquisitions, or thinking about partnering, etc. So this ties in with this area. What we mean by vertical integration is really moving into other activities along the value network. If you think of the value network as a sort of a line of, let's say, inbound operations logistics, and or indeed inbound in terms of the supply of component parts, and indeed outbound in terms of distribution, end consumer, etc. We're really talking about a line, and there are many, many businesses along that line. So when we think about, let's say, backward integration, we're really saying that a firm could consider moving into activities that supply it or supply the current business. So, for example, if we're talking about electricity distribution, we could buy into an electricity generating company. So we're going back as opposed to forward. Reverse side, if we said forward integration, I guess in one sense we're talking about activities that the customers of the existing business are performing. So we're looking about moving forward towards the customer, e.g. car manufacturer, perhaps thinking, let's set up a dealership so that we can be closer to the customer itself. So in terms of integration, this is certainly an area that's relevant in this whole value network discussion. We could move backwards, we could move forwards. What's the best approach? Now, in terms of advantages, clearly, if we think to ourselves, integration or vertical integration is a good idea. Clearly, we're doing it in order to gain more profits, gain more revenue. But also think about the fact that, it may well be in this particular market, in this particular industry, we may well have no choice. It may be necessary for us to integrate because of factors relevant in the market or industry. It may well be for us to keep stable, to keep in play as a player within this industry. We need to get involved in, let's say, our supply or indeed our distribution in some way, shape or form. So several reasons certainly to consider integration in some way, shape or form. What about disadvantages? What about the things that would stop us buying up a supplier or perhaps buying up one of our outsourced distributors? Well, the first things first is we don't really know anything, let's say, about distribution. We don't have the capability to operate or run a business such as that. We're good at what we do. We have core competence. Outside of that, distraction. It may well be that getting involved in other types of businesses, whether or not that's distribution or perhaps raw material manufacture as well, may take our concentration away from our core business, what we're good at. Maybe it's not a good idea. We don't want to be distracted. So perhaps integration for us is a bad idea for those reasons. Okay? Let's look at this last area. So, and this really brings it all together. Remember that this chapter is about competition and indeed competitive forces. And indeed, when we looked at that key model, Porter's 5 forces, what we were trying to do with that model is to establish within a given industry or market whether or not the industry or market is attractive or profitable. And really our conclusion will be either, not very attractive at all, not profitable, overly so, because these forces are extremely strong. Okay, or maybe the reverse, very, very attractive, perhaps very, very profitable because the forces are weak. Now, obviously, we're generalizing a little bit. Now, what do we mean by, I guess, opportunities and threats, this section 4? Well, in essence, what we mean is that in terms of choosing tactics, in terms of choosing moves that we make within this particular market is, assessing competitive strength or assessing competitive forces is certainly going to guide our strategy. But when we assess these forces, certainly, it doesn't simply mean that we exit a market because the forces are extremely high, or we don't enter the market because the forces are extremely high. We can certainly consider all of the areas, the threats, for example, and we can try and do something about them. We can try to overcome them, and that's what Porter suggests. Certainly, firms must consider these areas and consider whether or not they can overcome threats. And the flip side is also true. Not everything is bad. We could look and indeed find opportunities and indeed ways around problems. Okay, so this really sort of concludes this chapter on competitive forces. Remember what I said in terms of reference to the exam. Of this chapter, I would say so far, really that key model, Porter's 5 forces, is where it's at. Understanding that model is important, and indeed how the forces work. What drives the force up or the threat up, what drives it down. Do get a fix on that, and indeed remember that question practice is the way to bring things together on the day. Watching the videos is an excellent idea, making some notes, but let's get into the questions. Okay, thanks for listening.